Our next speaker is Erik Berg. And Erik is an avocational historian and writer who grew up in Flagstaff, Arizona, and he now lives in Phoenix. Erik has had many of his articles published in the Journal of Arizona History, Arizona Highways, Canyon Views of the Grand Canyon Conservancy, and other publications. And a big shout out to Erik for serving on the board of the Grand Canyon Historical Society for 6 years, and from 2009 to 2012, he was the president of our organization. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Erik Berg.
Thank you, Wayne, and thank you, all of you, for being here today. On the south rim of the Grand Canyon at Yavapai Point, a small stone nondescript building sits quietly on the edge and stares out over the abyss. You know the one I'm talking about. If you approach it from the parking lot side, it looks like little more than a loose stack of rocks. In fact, were it not for a sign reading Yavapai Geology Museum, one might very well wonder what this structure actually is. Yet perhaps no building in the entire National Park Service has had so much time, expertise, and thought invested into such a small area. Over a dozen leading national scientists, educators, and early park luminaries contributed to the design and operation of this building. Originally envisioned as a revolutionary way for visitors to understand the scientific and natural processes behind the scenic views, it employed what were at the time some very leading-edge ideas, thoughts, and tools around interpretation. The lessons learned here at this small museum would influence national park practices for decades to come. Inside the museum, there is a small plaque on the wall that acknowledges the various organizations and individuals that contributed to its construction and operation. Near the bottom of the list is the name Dr. John C. Merriam, and it is here with Merriam that the story of the Yavapai Geology Museum truly begins. Born in 1869, Merriam studied paleontology at the University of California at Berkeley, and years later, after he got his PhD, he returned there to join the faculty. He was an early pioneering investigator at the La Brea Char Pits and also at the John Day Fossil Beds in Oregon. He was also an early advocate of conservation, and in 1918, he helped organize the Save the Redwoods League. This organization also included Stephen Mather, the director of the recently created National Park Service. 2 years later, in 1920, Merriam was offered the position of president of the Carnegie Institution of Washington, D.C., an early think tank funded by Andrew Carnegie to spur scientific research in a variety of fields. Merriam accepted the position, but only on the condition that each summer he could return back home to California. It was during such a trip back to California in the summer of 1924 that Merriam decided to take a little detour and stop by the Grand Canyon. At the superintendent's office, he saw some specimens of fossil footprints that had recently been taken from along the Hermit Trail. Now, Merriam was still essentially a paleontologist at heart, and he had to see that location for himself. So the next morning, he started hiking down the Hermit Trail. He went down through the fossilized seabeds of the Kaibab limestone on the rim and down into the Coconino with the lithified sand dunes of an ancient desert. Further down in the canyon, he could see the reddish layers of what were the remnants of old swamps that had formed the Hermit Shale. He encountered the footprints toward the bottom of the Coconino. Although they were millions of years old, they were still very sharp and distinct. They looked like they could have just been laid there yesterday. It did not take a geologist to realize that the layers above and the ancient seas that had created them had obviously occurred after these footprints were laid in the sand. And likewise, these fossilized sand dunes had come in and been created long after the earlier landscapes, the swamps below, had been created. Nowhere before had Merriam seen a place where the geologic principles of superposition and erosion were so vividly illustrated. Writing to Mather, he exclaimed, quote, "I was enormously impressed by the opportunity for one of the most important exhibits in the world." Now, Merriam, of course, was not the only one thinking about education in the national parks. Mather and his assistant, Horace Albright, had actually identified education as one of the primary purposes of the national park system. But at the time, if a park had a museum at all, it was likely just a spare room filled with a random collection of artifacts and specimens. In 1922, Yosemite naturalist Ansel Hall inspired Chauncey Hamlin of the American Association of Museums, or AAM, to organize the Committee on Museums and National Parks for the purpose of studying the feasibility of parks in museums and advocating for their construction. Given his background, Merriam was quickly recruited to join. Other key committee members included Hall, Robert Yard of the National Parks Association, and Dr. Herman Bumpus, a retired biology professor and one of the founders of the AAM. For their first project, Hamlin received a grant from the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial Foundation to fund a new model museum at Yosemite. Hall supervised the project and worked very closely with the architect, Herbert Meyer. But some committee members recognized the limitations of traditional museums and wanted to see smaller exhibits located closer to the actual natural features that they were explaining. Writing to Bumpus, Merriam expressed concern that in a traditional museum, quote, "the interpretive material will take the place of the thing itself." Instead, Merriam envisioned an approach that would replicate his experience on the Hermit Trail, but he admitted to Bumpus that, quote, "the kind of park museum which I have in mind is not going to be easy to construct." In the spring of 1926, the AAM received an additional grant from the foundation to build 2 smaller trailside museums. Seeing a chance to pursue his ideas, Merriam successfully lobbied to have one of these museums located at Grand Canyon. That September, he visited the canyon to refine his ideas and examine possible sites for the new museum. He was aided in this work by paleontologist David White, who was there studying the fossils of the Hermit Shale. Now, initially, the complexity of his own vision caused Merriam to question the feasibility of the entire undertaking. Quote, "I had some doubt whether we could even approach the matter," he later admitted to Bumpus. But at Yavapai Point, the spectacular views filled him with a renewed inspiration. The location offered a rare glimpse of the river and clear views of most of the rock layers. Here, he explained to Bumpus, you could see, quote, "practically every phase of the physical geology, the history of life, the adaptation of present life, and the expression of aesthetic or inspirational values." So look for those things the next time you're there. Now, Merriam documented his plan in an article that was published in the AAM newsletter. The new facility would emphasize, quote, "making the canyon the exhibit." It would feature an open viewing platform where visitors could use viewfinders and telescopes to see for themselves the key features in the canyon walls. A relief model of the canyon would help locate those features in the larger canyon system, and a separate room in the back would contain additional displays and specimens. But the goal was not to pull visitors' attention inside to look at exhibits, but rather to direct it outside at the canyon itself. It would be a museum turned inside out. Merriam also saw it as a starting point for a much larger integrated canyon-wide system of trailside exhibits, informative signs, and guide booklets. Merriam considered the project to be, quote, "one of the most striking educational opportunities in the world." Since the original grant would barely cover construction costs, Merriam obtained an additional $6,000 from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Meanwhile, work on the canyon relief model started in Washington under the supervision of noted canyon cartographer Francois Mathis. The AAM again hired Meyer to design the new building, but they initially started him working on the canyon model. However, Meyer turned out to be better at creating buildings than canyons. Writing to Merriam, Yard complained that Meyer was making numerous errors on the model, saying, quote, "he can't really help it, he's thick-fingered." Fortunately, Mathis knew a young geology student named Edwin McKee who could take over the modeling work and soon proved extremely capable at it. Quote, "McKee, it seems, is a find," wrote Yard approvingly. Throughout the spring of 1927, Merriam consulted with a variety of scientists. In addition to White and Mathis, Merriam also sought the advice of geologists Herbert Gregory, Charles Gilmore, and Levi Noble. He also enlisted the support of Carnegie Institution geophysicist Frederick Wright and Berkeley zoologist Harold Bryant. In their planning, Merriam stressed the importance on focusing on those canyon features that best illustrated key scientific concepts. If visitors could see these features for themselves in the canyon, he hoped they might derive the correct conclusions largely on their own. By July, Meyer had completed the initial blueprints. Made of local stone, the museum featured an open viewing porch, which they called the parapet, and a separate exhibit hall. But just as construction was ready to start, two issues arose, one political and one practical. Merriam thought that the term museum was a bit too limiting and called the new structure the Yavapai Observation Station. But Bumpus insisted on the museum title, partially because that was the specific term used in the original grant. The ensuing kerfluffle produced a flurry of heated emails among the various committee members, leading an exasperated Merriam to exclaim, quote, "I do not know that I have ever seen so small a matter smear itself around to such an extent." To placate Bumpus, they eventually did accept the title of Trailside Museum, though other names persisted. A bigger concern, however, was managing the project itself. At Yosemite, the AAM had hired private contractors to build the museum, and then after its completion, they had turned it over to the Park Service. They had planned a similar approach for the Grand Canyon, but quickly realized that bringing in outside workers was going to be prohibitively expensive. Instead, they looked at a more cost-effective approach of having NPS workers do the actual construction, with the grants funding the tools and materials. This approach was acceptable to Park Superintendent Minor Tillotson, but government finance rules prevented the easy transfer of funds from a private organization. Ultimately, they used the National Academy of Science, whose unique status as a government-chartered institution allowed it freer interaction with both private and government groups. The Academy would receive various funds and then reimburse the park through work done. David White, who was at the time the Academy Secretary, effectively served as the project's treasurer. With these difficulties resolved, construction began in late summer of 1927. And there you see construction going on at the initial walls for Yavapai. A key feature of the building was a stratigraphic column made of actual rocks from the Grand Canyon layers. Mathis designed the pillar and directed the park's naturalist Glenn Studevart to collect the necessary rock specimens. By late fall, the building's roofless shell was largely complete, but both funds and temperatures were starting to run low. In December, work stopped entirely for the winter. The following spring, Merriam received additional funds from the Carnegie Corporation and work resumed. By the end of June, the building was essentially complete. The relief model arrived from Washington along with McKee, who had helped Studevant run the museum. On July 19, 1928, the officially named Trailside Museum and Observation Station at Yavapai Point held its official opening ceremony, with Merriam and Tillotson giving short speeches. Over the summer, biologist Vernon Bailey and geologists Nelson Darton and Wallace Atwood visited to give lectures, consult on exhibits, and share their expertise with park rangers. Merriam confidently observed that, quote, "There is no doubt in my mind that the program upon which we are working at Yavapai Point is extremely important." Although the building was completed, much work still remained to be done. To help visitors see distant features, the parapet included a telescope and several Army surplus battery commander rangefinders. But the back room was still mostly empty, and there was little in the way of directions or exhibits. During their lectures, rangers also found it difficult to point out specific canyon features when there were large crowds. They resolved this by designing a contraption called a directoscope that could align multiple small, simple viewfinders on a single location. But even in its unfinished state, the museum quickly became popular with visitors, and Tillotson called it, quote, "a most valuable and artistic addition to the park." While acknowledging the many people involved, he observed that it was Merriam that, quote, "was the prime mover in the initiation and planning of the structure and in evolving the plan of operating it." The winter of 1928-29 saw only incremental work on the largely unfinished exhibit hall. McKee had to return to school in the fall, and in February, Studevant and another ranger tragically drowned while crossing the river. They had been collecting specimens for the museum, and Merriam felt the loss personally. After graduating, McKee was hired to fill Studevant's position as the park naturalist. That summer, Merriam again invited scientists to give public lectures and consult on the educational program. These included David White, Douglas Johnson, and John Buwalda. While impressed with many aspects of the museum, these experts also identified areas for improvement. Johnson was displeased with one of the ranger talks he attended, telling Merriam, quote, "that to say it was bad is to speak very mildly." And he found that many people were using the telescopes not to look at natural features, but to search in the canyon for mules and for the river bridge. White felt that the exhibit room itself should be entirely closed off until it was properly set up, and concluded that, quote, "We still have several years before Yavapai can be made, from the material standpoint alone, to approach the standard to which it must be brought." Merriam himself visited the canyon that summer. Like Johnson, he was frustrated that the telescopes were not being used as intended, and that many of the larger educational goals were unfinished or unclear to visitors. Based on his own observation, those of the scientists and committee members, and input from McKee, Merriam devised a clear plan of action in the form of several lengthy memos and letters. The parapet, he noted, should focus on a sequential series of distinct views, or specific points in the canyon representing key scientific concepts or natural phenomena. As just one example to illustrate the first appearance of plants and insects in the fossil record, view number 9 would feature binoculars aimed at the Hermit Shale where those things occurred. In the exhibit hall, the corresponding Station 9 would include related photographs displayed as illuminated transparencies and an exhibit case containing fossil specimens. Visitors would move left to right along the parapet, observing each view in turn, and then proceed to the exhibit hall and follow the same sequence there. Merriam's directions extended beyond the building itself. In a nod to the botanists, 3 small gardens would contain plants from each of the canyon's environmental life zones. Other memos advocated for better communication with the lodges and bus tours, creating signs and smaller exhibits along the trails, and developing a series of leaflets for other canyon locations. Summarizing his plans, Merriam reminded the committee that the entire project was, quote, "an experiment in education, but if successful, the lessons could be transferred to other parks, and thus, quote, the Park Service will contribute more to the life of the nation than it has been able to do so in the past." Despite the extensive plans, little work was done that winter. In March of 1930, Merriam asked Albright to dedicate Hall, McKee, and NPS photographer George Grant to finishing the job. Grant would take photographs for the transparencies, McKee would work on the displays, and Hall would supervise. Albright agreed, and that summer saw rapid progress. The exhibit hall was finally completed, and the telescopes were fixed in place and supplemented with field glasses. However, bowing to popular demand, they set up a couple of free-motion telescopes outside to indulge in humanity's innate nature to see burrows and bridges. Ranger and botanist Pauline Mead began planting the Life Zone gardens. Now, Grant had taken many images of the rock layers and of the various plants and animals around the canyon. These pictures helped illustrate the area's complex geology and botany, but could not all fit into the exhibit hall. Hall and Merriam learned that the Bosch & Loam Company had recently developed a so-called Balopticon automated viewing machine that could run through a deck of photographic slides, projecting them onto a small screen, basically the early version of a PowerPoint presentation. They ordered 2 of these, one to cover geology and one for biology for the back exhibit hall. To show the power of the Colorado River, Hall also purchased an automated movie machine from the Dramograph Company to play a river clip donated by Emery Kolb. By year's end, most of the work was done, and in February of 1931, Hall submitted his final report. The core elements of Merriam's vision was finally complete. Over the following years, exhibits, labels, and leaflets went through various revisions. Simple trail site exhibits were set up at White's Fossil Quarry on the Kaibab Trail and elsewhere. As with any experiment, however, not everything proved successful. Some visitors had little interest in nature or science, and others had little patience for a tightly scripted experience. Protecting and maintaining the equipment was a constant challenge. During one visit, Merriam was horrified to watch as several small boys, quote, amused themselves by whirling the telescopes around to see how fast they could go. But overall, the museum became one of the park's most popular attractions with up to 26,000 visitors per month by 1936. Now, starting in late 1930, Merriam began to shift his focus to the new Sinnott Memorial at Crater Lake, which was modeled on the Yavapai Museum. But he remained interested in Grand Canyon until his retirement in 1938, and his work would continue far beyond his departure. Many people had contributed to the Grand Canyon project, but it was Merriam who had consolidated and refined the various ideas into a single cohesive plan. Hall, Bryant, and Tillotson had long careers with the Park Service and likely applied their experiences with Merriam to later work. This is especially true of McKee, who had become one of the canyon's leading geologists. As late as 1957, NPS Chief of Interpretation Ronald Lee would point to Merriam's work and say, quote, this is the standard by which our current interpretive planning efforts ought to be measured. But for a building dedicated to nature's power to shape and evolve, it cannot escape change itself. In the 1950s, glass windows enclosed the parapet, and the wall separating the exhibit room was removed. Ongoing changes over the years tended toward simplicity and ease of maintenance. By the late 1970s, the geologic column, the telescopes, and most of the displays were gone, and the building was increasingly becoming a gift shop. Visiting in 1978, McKee was shocked to see the changes. Quote, "It seems little short of vandalism," he angrily wrote to Superintendent Stitt, asking where can the average visitor now turn to get answers to his questions. It would take another 3 decades to answer McKee's question. In the early 2000s, a new team, many of which are here today, began the work of returning the museum to its interpretive roots. Following a rededication ceremony in 2007, the parapet again invites visitors to understand the natural features behind the scenery while supporting exhibits describe the ancient landscapes that created the canyon's rock layers. In 2010, the new Trail of Time provides visitors with an immersive sense of geologic timespans, and hopefully some of you have been able to go on the tours with Carl and Laura, who were instrumental in putting that together. Once again, the Yavapai Geology Museum reaffirms the educational value of the national parks. With the possible exception of its name, Merriam would undoubtedly approve. Thank you.